In the fall of 1847, investigators in Massachusetts stumbled upon a discovery that would forever disturb those who witnessed it. Buried beneath the peaceful hills of what was known as Ellington's Educational Farm were 43 small graves, each belonging to a child between the ages of 6 and 12, all of whom had vanished long before reaching 14. Officially, these children had been sent west to live with prosperous families, but the truth was far more horrifying. For nearly 20 years, Josiah and Constance Ellington operated what appeared to be a benevolent institution for orphan children. But behind the illusion of care and education lay a system of abuse and forced labor so cruel that death became the only escape for many of them. The state buried the investigation so deeply that even today few historians know about the Ellington Farm scandal. What unfolded between 1829 and 1847 remains one of the darkest chapters in America's industrial age, exposing the brutal cost of progress on society's most defenseless members. In 1829, as Massachusetts surged forward with the promise of industrial prosperity, cities like Lowell and Lawrence thrived on the output of textile mills. But the rapid growth brought with it a wave of tragedy. Fathers lost to factory accidents, mothers claimed by disease, and families torn apart by urbanization, leaving hundreds of children orphaned and homeless. Into this growing crisis stepped Josiah Ellington, a former mill supervisor with sharp eyes, white hair, and the commanding presence of a preacher. His wife Constance was equally formidable, intelligent, meticulous, and skilled in financial matters. The couple owned a 200-acre estate in Berkshire County, a picturesque stretch of land that had been in Josiah's family since the Revolutionary War. With rolling meadows, dense woodlands, and a stream to power a small grist mill, it looked like an ideal haven for raising children away from the grit of the cities. Josiah presented his plan to municipal leaders in several mill towns. He would house up to 20 orphans at a time, providing food, shelter, education, and moral instruction in exchange for only a small annual subsidy per child. The timing was perfect. Cities were overwhelmed by the sheer number of homeless children, and the offer of a clean rural environment where kids could learn and grow seemed like a miracle. Testimonials from officials, including a glowing endorsement from a county welfare inspector, praised Ellington as a man of Christian character and agricultural knowledge. However, not everyone was convinced. Reverend Daniel Parker, who had interviewed Josiah during the application process, later recalled feeling uneasy. There was a disturbing coldness in the way Ellington described discipline, referring to children as if they were livestock, useful only if they could be controlled. Despite these warnings, desperation won out. In June 1829, the first group of children arrived at the Ellington farm. Among them was 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell, a bright boy orphaned by a tragic mill fire. His caseworker described him as full of promise, capable of reading and counting rare skills for a child of his background. But what awaited Timothy was not the nurturing sanctuary that had been promised. The children's living quarters were located in the basement of the Maine farmhouse, a cold, damp room intended for storage. 22 children were crammed into the space, sleeping on moldy straw mattresses with no proper ventilation and only a single window the size of a small animal. Each day began before dawn with Constance Ellington banging a metal pot to rouse the children. There was no time for hygiene or personal care. They were expected to be ready for work in minutes. An exhausting routine repeated daily, with no relief, no education, and no affection. This was not a farm school. It was a prison disguised as charity, and for the 43 children buried beneath those hills, it became their final resting place. Breakfast at the Ellington farm was a thin, watery cornmeal gruel. sometimes accompanied by a slice of mold-rimmed bread. Children who dared complain or failed to eat every bite were denied the midday meal. Work began immediately after breakfast and stretched past sunset. During harvest, even 6-year-olds labored up to 16 hours a day, picking apples, hauling water, clearing stones, and cleaning mill machinery. A dangerous task that often left them with cuts, crushed fingers, and lasting injuries. Timothy Caldwell suffered his first serious injury just 3 weeks in. While removing debris from the mill, his hand was caught between grinding stones, crushing 2 fingers and leaving deep infected wounds. Josiah's response revealed his true philosophy. He locked the injured boy in a shed with only water until he agreed to return to work later, writing in his private journal that pampering children only encouraged laziness and that survival was a test of worthiness. But it was Sarah Brennan's fate that first exposed the horror of the Ellington farm. 10 years old, red-haired, and recently orphaned by tuberculosis. Sarah arrived in August 1829, described by her placement worker as bright and obedient with a gift for sewing. Within weeks, malnutrition consumed her. Her hair fell out, her teeth loosened, her skin turned ashen. Deemed useless, her rations were reduced further, and she was moved to an isolated room in the cellar. According to surviving children, her cries echoed through the basement during her final nights. Yet anyone who attempted to help her was beaten. On October 15, 1829, Sarah died alone and starving. Her death went unreported. Instead, Josiah sent a forged letter to the Boston agency claiming Sarah had been adopted by a prosperous family heading west. The letter was so convincing it earned him praise from the very officials responsible for her care. That night, Josiah and Constance buried her body by lantern light beneath a stand of oak trees behind the farmhouse, the first grave in what would become a secret cemetery holding the remains of 43 vanished children. As winter set in that year, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every few months, another child would disappear. Their absence explained by letters boasting of new families and bright futures out west. No one questioned these stories, not the overwhelmed city agencies, nor the community who saw Josiah as a generous moral pillar. The children who remained quickly learned silence was safer than curiosity. Timothy Caldwell survived that first winter, but his spirit was broken. Once described as eager and bright, he became silent and withdrawn. Caseworkers visiting the farm noted the change, but accepted Josiah's explanation that it was just part of adjusting to rural life. They never saw the root cellar where children who failed to meet quotas were locked for days with nothing but scraps and filth. Nor did they witness the isolation chambers, where sick children were left to either recover alone or quietly die in the darkness. The Ellingtons ran a meticulously controlled system. Constance kept 2 sets of records, one for officials, complete with cheerful updates and fabricated adoption placements, and another hidden behind the fireplace that listed death dates, causes, and burial sites scattered across the property. By 1832, only 3 years into their operation, 27 children had died. Yet records falsely claimed that of the 41 children placed at the farm, 39 had found new homes in the West. The inconsistencies should have raised suspicion, but the Ellingtons exploited the flaws of their era. Communication between states was slow and unreliable. Record-keeping was inconsistent, and the agencies were too overwhelmed to follow up. Letters could be forged, journeys couldn't be traced, and officials had neither the time nor the budget for audits. To the outside world, the Ellingtons were upstanding citizens. Josiah regularly attended town meetings in Hillsdale, donated to the church, and delivered stirring speeches about the importance of guiding lost children back to virtue. His charm, wealth, and supposed good deeds cemented a reputation that shielded their crimes for nearly 2 decades. Behind the facade, however, the Ellington farm was not a sanctuary. It was a quiet, calculated death machine that preyed on the vulnerable and hid their graves in the shadows of rural Massachusetts. Judge Marcus Fairfield, who served as the Justice of the Peace for Berkshire County during the years the Ellington farm operated, would later confess that he had never questioned Josiah Ellington's intentions. To him, the man seemed righteous, even saintly, providing what appeared to be a solution to the rising orphan crisis. The children Fairfield occasionally saw on his rare visits seemed quiet and obedient. If they looked thin or wore tattered clothes, he chalked it up to the rigors of outdoor living and simple farm life. Ellington, after all, appeared to be doing the Lord's work. But while Fairfield saw only what the Ellingtons wanted him to see, there were others who caught glimpses of the truth. Among the most important witnesses was Jacob Fletcher, a traveling tinker, whose route regularly brought him to farms across western Massachusetts. Over the years, Fletcher visited the Ellington property multiple times each season and began noticing troubling signs. Unlike the curious, lively farm children he encountered elsewhere, the Ellington children were silent and wary. They kept their eyes lowered, spoke only when spoken to, and wore ragged clothes through which their ribs were visible. Most unsettling of all was the quiet. A farm with 20 children should echo with laughter and voices, but the Ellington property felt more like a cemetery. Fletcher's repeated visits allowed him to observe changes over time. In the spring of 1834, he counted 18 children working the fields. By autumn, there were only 11. Josiah's explanation was always the same: the children had been blessed with placement in good Christian homes out west. The phrase became so frequent that Fletcher began to suspect it was nothing more than a rehearsed lie. And yet, what troubled him most was the absence of older children. In 6 years, he never saw anyone over the age of 12 or 13. In any normal household, children would grow mature and eventually take on more responsibility. But at the Ellington farm, it was as if time stood still, and no child ever reached adolescence. Then came the drought of 1836, a disaster that dried up the stream powering the mill and turned pastures to dust. For most farmers, it meant hardship and belt-tightening. For the Ellington children, it meant starvation. Without the mill's income or viable crops, Josiah faced a financial crisis that risked exposing his operation. His solution was cruelly simple. He would reduce the number of mouths to feed. Over 3 months, 7 children died from malnutrition, their bodies too weak to survive on scraps of corn and wild berries. Among the dead was Timothy Caldwell, the boy who had survived injury isolation in the brutal winter of 1829. Now, nearly 12, Timothy had grown stronger, but years of starvation had taken their toll. He died on August 18, 1836, in the same storage room where Sarah Brennan had died 7 years earlier. Timothy's death proved to be a turning point, not because it stirred the Ellingtons' conscience, but because it triggered the first real scrutiny of the farm. His placement had been handled by a Boston charity that required yearly updates, and Timothy himself had been taught to write letters. Those letters, of course, were fabrications penned by Constance Ellington, who had become skilled at mimicking a child's tone and handwriting. But in 1836, no letter arrived. Timothy's caseworker, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, grew concerned. She sent a letter to Josiah inquiring about the boy. Josiah replied in his usual manner, detailed, calm, and completely false. He claimed Timothy had been adopted by a Methodist family heading west to Kansas and had expressed gratitude and excitement about his new life. Yet the tone of the letter raised red flags. In Mrs. Hartwell's experience, children rarely spoke with such detached maturity about leaving the only stable environment they'd known. Something about it felt wrong, trusting her instincts. Mrs. Hartwell made a decision that would crack the Ellingtons' carefully built facade. On September 23, 1836, she arrived at the farm unannounced. The timing caught Constance off guard. She was preparing the evening meal, little more than a thin broth made from potato peels and scraps of fat, when she spotted a woman in city clothes stepping out of a hired buggy. Her expression was serious, determined, and unmistakably official. For the first time in 7 years, the Ellingtons were not prepared. The cracks in their operation were about to widen. Josiah was in the fields overseeing the children when Constance, realizing the threat that had just arrived at their doorstep, sent 7-year-old Peter Hoffman to fetch him. Peter ran through the brittle rows of dying corn with the urgency of a child who knew that even a moment's delay could bring punishment. By the time Josiah reached the house, Mrs. Hartwell had already taken control of the conversation. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I would like to see Timothy Caldwell," she said firmly. "I've come a long way and I won't leave without speaking to him." Caught off guard, Josiah responded with his usual calm, but beneath the surface his desperation was showing. "I'm afraid that's not possible, ma'am. Young Timothy left just last week with the Thornton family headed for Kansas territory. They were anxious to beat the winter snow." Mrs. Hartwell, experienced and sharp-eyed, immediately spotted the inconsistency. "That's strange," she said. "Your letter mentioned a Methodist family, not the Thorntons." "Are the Thorntons Methodist?" Josiah hesitated just for a moment, but it was enough. "Why, yes, of course. The Thorntons are devout Methodists. I simply misspoke in my letter." Mrs. Hartwell didn't respond. Her attention had shifted to the children visible through the parlor window, toiling silently in what remained of the vegetable garden. Their movements were slow and lifeless, their clothing oversized and ragged, their bodies clearly malnourished. Turning back to Josiah, her voice took on a tone that left no room for refusal. "I'd like to speak with some of the other children. I assume you have no objections, since several were placed here through my organization." For the first time since the farm's founding, someone was looking behind the curtain. Over the next 3 hours, Mrs. Hartwell inspected the children's living quarters and interviewed several of them. What she discovered left her stunned. The sleeping area was overcrowded, filthy, and lacked even basic sanitation. Many of the children were clearly underweight and suffering from untreated illnesses. But it was their emotional state that shocked her most. When asked about missing children, particularly Timothy, the reactions ranged from terror to tears. One girl no older than 9 broke down sobbing when his name was mentioned. "He got sick and then he went away," she whispered. "But we're not supposed to talk about the ones who go away." Mrs. Hartwell's visit would become the first documented exposure of what had been happening at the Ellington farm. Her report to the Massachusetts Board of State Charities detailed the appalling conditions and the alarming pattern of unaccounted-for children. But even with her damning findings, systemic limitations of the time meant justice would not come swiftly. Cross-state investigations were cumbersome and expensive, and the lack of centralized records made it easy for institutions like the Ellington farm to operate in the shadows. Still, the visit sparked a crisis for Josiah and Constance. Their carefully constructed image was beginning to crack. Within days, they began making arrangements to shut down the farm. But this created a new dilemma. 11 children remained all witnesses to the years of abuse and death. Relocating them risked exposure. Transferring them to other institutions could result in testimony that would uncover the graves hidden throughout the property. To Josiah, these children were now liabilities that had to be dealt with. What followed was a chilling scheme designed to erase both the witnesses and the evidence. During the winter of 1836 to 1837, Josiah began spreading news of a supposed relocation. He told neighbors and local officials that he planned to move the entire operation to Missouri, where farmland was abundant and the climate ideal for year-round agriculture. He spoke of new opportunities of gratitude for the community's support and of his noble mission continuing out west. The story served multiple purposes. It justified the closure of the farm, explained the sudden disappearance of the Ellingtons, and gave the community a hopeful narrative about the children's futures. But the truth behind the public story was far more sinister. While everyone expected Josiah and Constance to depart with the surviving children, what actually happened would remain buried for years, just like the 43 small bodies hidden beneath the soil of a farm that had masqueraded as salvation. Between December 1836 and March 1837, all 11 remaining children at the Ellington farm died. Their deaths were spaced out deliberately timed to coincide with severe winter storms when visitors were unlikely. Years later, investigators uncovered Josiah Ellington's journal, and within its pages lay chilling evidence of calculated cruelty. The entries reflected a man not burdened by guilt, but driven by logistics. December 18th. The Hoffman boy has developed a persistent cough that disrupts the others' sleep. Isolated him in the root cellar until the cough resolves permanently. The winter cold should expedite matters. January 4th. Mary Sullivan continues to ask questions about Timothy and the others. Her curiosity makes her unsuitable for relocation. Have reduced her rations accordingly. February 22nd, only 3 remain. The work of preparing for our departure to Missouri proceeds more efficiently with fewer distractions. And then on March 15th, 1837, a single final line, the Lord's work is complete. Tomorrow we begin our new life. By spring, the farm stood silent. Josiah and Constance were the only ones left. The house that once echoed with children's voices was now a tomb. The fields once filled with forced labor had grown wild. And in the oak grove behind the farmhouse, 38 fresh graves joined the 5 that had already been dug over the years, 43 children in total, erased from records but not from history. Yet the Ellingtons had made a critical mistake. While they had covered their tracks carefully, their escape narrative was too specific to remain unchecked. Mrs. Hartwell's earlier report had triggered a slow but growing investigation. Boston officials began cross-checking placement records, noting discrepancies and missing adoption confirmations. Attention shifted from missing children to potential fraud. The numbers didn't add up. Subsidies had been claimed for nearly 200 children, but not one adoptive family could be located. No letters, no follow-up correspondence, no trails west. Meanwhile, Jacob Fletcher, the tinker, whose early suspicions had started this chain of scrutiny, remained relentless. He began inquiring with wagon masters and shipping agents about the Ellingtons' alleged move to Missouri. He found nothing. No family matching their description had hired wagons or booked passage. Then he discovered the farm had been sold quietly and through intermediaries to a lumber company in Albany. Josiah had not appeared in person to finalize the deal. The buyers were told the owners were already out west. Fletcher's suspicions deepened, and in the summer of 1837, he returned to the abandoned property. What he saw would confirm his worst fears: patches of ground that had been leveled and regrown, but bore signs of recent disturbance. To a seasoned farmhand, they looked exactly like hidden graves. Back in Boston, investigators uncovered financial irregularities tied to the Ellington operation. The fraudulent scale of the subsidy claims became clear. The success rates the Ellingtons boasted were logistically impossible, and still no adoptive families came forward. The evidence was mounting, but the final breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, Constance Ellington. By 1847, a decade after they had supposedly fled west, Constance was living under a false name in Hartford, Connecticut. Josiah had died of pneumonia in 1843, and Constance, left penniless, descended into madness. Neighbors described episodes of religious mania, and she began attending multiple churches each Sunday, offering strange, rambling confessions. Children who need forgiveness, she would whisper graves that cry out. Her landlord, disturbed, contacted local clergy. One of them, Reverend Thomas Hayes, listened carefully when Constance seized his arm after a sermon and said, "43 little souls, Reverend. 43 children who never got to grow up because we were too proud to admit we had failed them." Hayes documented everything and alerted Massachusetts authorities. Investigators following the lead returned to the long-abandoned Ellington farm in September 1847. The team included representatives from the Board of State Charities, local law enforcement, and medical examiners. Guided by Constance's confessions and Fletcher's earlier observations, they began digging. The first grave contained the remains of a child around 10 years old. The body was wrapped in a decaying cloth marked with the initials S.B. Sarah Brennan, the red-haired girl who had died in 1829. Over the next 3 weeks, 42 more graves were uncovered, their contents confirming what the paper trail had only suggested. The victims were between 6 and 13 years old. Many showed signs of severe malnutrition. Some bore untreated injuries. Others had been clearly neglected for long periods. The horror didn't end with the graves. Hidden behind a false wall in the farmhouse basement, investigators found Josiah's personal journal. It cataloged each child's name, age, date of death, and his rationale for their demise. But it read less like a caregiver's notes and more like a logbook of livestock losses. The children were referred to as units, resources, drains, and investments that failed to yield. The humanity was gone. What remained was a monstrous record of systemic dehumanization. The Ellington farm scandal would go on to become one of the most disturbing cases in early American institutional history. It revealed how bureaucratic gaps, social neglect, and unchecked authority allowed two individuals to exploit and ultimately destroy the lives of the very children they had claimed to save. The legacy of the Ellington children, buried in unmarked graves and forgotten for years, became a symbol of both systemic failure and the power of persistence of one caseworker, one traveling tinker, and a confession spoken through trembling lips that brought the truth back into the light. The final entries in Josiah Ellington's journal revealed not only the human cost of the tragedy, but also the full scale of the fraud behind it. Josiah had continued to claim state subsidies for children long after they had died, creating false records and cheerful letters to keep up appearances. In several cases, he collected payments for over 5 years after a child's death, all while reporting them as thriving under his care. But the most chilling discovery came in a separate ledger, where Josiah had coldly calculated the acceptable death rate for financial optimization. According to his estimates, losing about 20% of the children annually could be passed off as normal mortality. Any higher risked suspicion. To stay within that boundary, he adjusted food rations and working conditions, managing deaths with the same detached precision as one might manage crop yields. Constance Ellington's confession completed the picture. She revealed how the operation had begun with accidental deaths, avoidable perhaps, but not initially intentional. Rather than report them and face investigation, the Ellingtons buried the bodies in secret and crafted lies to conceal the truth. Once we buried the first child in secret, Constance admitted we were trapped in a deception that only grew. Each death required more lies until we were living inside a fiction of our own making. Over time, Josiah began to believe they were doing society a favor, eliminating weak or disruptive children unfit for the hardships of frontier life. But Constance eventually acknowledged a far darker evolution. The children's deaths were no longer covered up out of fear. They were orchestrated as a strategy executed when resources were strained or obedience faltered. What began as a failed experiment in charity had become a methodical killing operation dressed in the language of moral duty. The exposure of the Ellington farm sent shockwaves through Massachusetts and beyond. It forced a reckoning within the state's child welfare system and led to a comprehensive overhaul of how institutions were regulated. Mandatory inspections, standardized record-keeping, and independent oversight boards were implemented to prevent such horrors from ever happening again. Constance was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Her 1848 trial gripped the nation. It was among the first in American history to focus on institutional crimes against children. The prosecution relied heavily on her confessions, the exhumed bodies, and Josiah's journals. Her defense claimed she had been dominated by her husband and mentally unstable, pointing to her religious obsessions and visible deterioration as evidence. But prosecutors countered with entries from Josiah's journal, revealing that Constance had played an active role in the murders, often suggesting the reduction of food isolation, of sick children, and the crafting of false correspondence. The 6-week trial included damning testimony from key witnesses, Jacob Fletcher, Mrs. Hartwell, and various officials who had unknowingly supported the Ellingtons. Medical examiners described the physical condition of the children's remains, detailing prolonged starvation, untreated injuries, and signs of chronic neglect. On July 15, 1848, the jury found Constance guilty on 37 counts of murder and additional charges of fraud and conspiracy. Though some jurors wished to recommend the death penalty, her deteriorating mental state swayed the verdict toward life imprisonment. Constance spent her final 12 years in a Massachusetts women's prison where tuberculosis eventually claimed her life in 1860. Prison records describe her final years as ones of religious fervor and emotional collapse. Guards often found her talking to the empty air, begging forgiveness and naming children long dead. The Ellington farm property was eventually acquired by the state and transformed into a memorial site. In the oak grove where the children were buried, individual headstones were placed, each inscribed with a name and age where known. The central marker reads, "In memory of 43 children who came seeking hope and found only suffering. May their sacrifice ensure such horrors never occur again." But the true legacy of the Ellington scandal went far beyond memorial stones. It sparked the first widespread child welfare reform movement in American history. The case exposed the dangers of unregulated private institutions and revealed how easily neglect and abuse could be masked behind Christian rhetoric and moral facades. In its wake, Massachusetts established new inspection protocols, enforcement standards, and legal protections for children in institutional care. Dr. Samuel Harrington, the official who had once praised Josiah's charitable work, spent the rest of his career advocating for systemic reform. In his 1851 report to the legislature, he wrote, "The Ellington case has taught us that good intentions are not enough. We must assume the potential for deception and build systems that ensure accountability at every level." The aftermath of the investigation uncovered similar abuses across New England, prompting broader reforms. And most significantly, the Ellington case set enduring legal precedents. For the first time, children were recognized not as property or burdens to be managed, but as individuals with rights worthy of protection, care, and justice. Between 1836 and 1847, the Ellington case grew from a hidden atrocity into one of the most defining scandals in American institutional history. The final death toll, 43 children, was not just a number, but a symbol of systemic betrayal. The revelations that followed the investigation shook the public to its core, not only because of the unimaginable cruelty, but because of who had committed it. Two individuals who had cloaked their crimes in the language of charity, morality, and duty. The concept of institutional accountability, now considered foundational in the regulation of schools, hospitals, and care homes, was in many ways born out of the Ellington trials. What began as a localized horror evolved into a turning point in American social policy. The public could no longer assume that good intentions and religious affiliations guaranteed safety. The belief that trusted authority figures always acted in the interest of those under their care was shattered. Jacob Fletcher, the traveling tinker who first voiced concern, never returned to his former self. Though he continued his trade for years, he often spoke publicly about the case, warning audiences that evil rarely enters with fanfare. It arrives disguised as virtue. It speaks of charity while demanding obedience. He told one crowd, and it destroys, in silence. His role in uncovering the truth became a personal mission driven by a newfound awareness that trusting appearances could cost lives. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, whose unshakable resolve cracked the facade, became a pioneer in child welfare reform. She advocated for laws mandating surprise inspections, formal reporting of deaths in institutional care, and rigorous vetting of all private orphan programs. Her advocacy helped lay the groundwork for the first statewide child protection protocols in Massachusetts. In her later writings, she condemned the systems that had allowed the Ellingtons to operate unchecked for so long. Writing, "We trusted forms over facts, reputations over reality, and distance over accountability. The children died because we did not care enough to look closer." Over time, the physical remnants of the Ellington farm were lost. The farmhouse was torn down in 1852. The fields reverted to forest. But the oak grove where the children were buried was preserved as a memorial cemetery. Visitors to the site often reported a quiet heaviness and oppressive silence that lingered among the trees. Locals claimed birds avoided nesting there, as if nature itself had been disturbed by what it had witnessed. The sealed records, including Josiah's journal and Constance's confessions, were not unsealed until 1947, exactly 100 years after the mass graves were discovered. When finally released to scholars, they offered rare insight into the psychological dynamics of institutional cruelty and what modern researchers now call organizational deviance. The slow, often unnoticed drift of institutions away from their missions and the development of internal cultures that normalize abuse and rationalize harm. What makes the Ellington story especially haunting is how easily it could have remained hidden. The children had been removed from the world, not just physically, but bureaucratically. False letters, forged adoption records, and falsified inspection reports meant that on paper they were thriving. In reality, they had been starved, silenced, and buried in shallow graves reduced to lies, written by the very people who had vowed to protect them. Today, the 43 small stones in the memorial cemetery serve as a somber warning. They are not just grave markers. They are reminders of how vulnerable populations can be exploited when society fails to ask hard questions. They represent every child who is unseen, every voice dismissed, every abuse ignored, because it is inconvenient or uncomfortable to confront. The Ellington farm was not built by monsters, it was sustained by silence, by indifference, and by a system that prioritized the appearance of virtue over the presence of truth. What do you think about this story? Was everything uncovered, or could there have been other institutions hiding similar atrocities during this time in American history? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this tale struck a chord, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. More stories like this, hidden, harrowing, and deeply human, are waiting to be told. Let's ensure these forgotten victims are remembered, and that the systems meant to protect never become cages again. See you in the next video. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.